What is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it the name they carry, the balance in their bank account, or the label on the clothes they wear? Or is it something deeper, something hidden from view, a quiet strength that can withstand the greatest storms? This is a story about a woman who was judged by the surface, and the powerful man who saw the treasure she kept hidden within. It is a story that asks us to look closer, to see beyond the facade, because sometimes, the most unassuming person in the room is the one who holds all the power. Elara felt the weight of 100 lifetimes pressing down on her as she stood in the grand ballroom of the Sterling Tower. Each crystal on the chandeliers seemed to mock her, winking with a brilliance she felt she could never possess. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of powerful conversations, felt too rich to breathe. She smoothed down the front of her simple, navy blue dress for the 10th time. It was elegant, the most expensive thing she had ever owned, yet in this sea of haute couture and bespoke tuxedos, she felt as conspicuous as a sparrow in a flock of peacocks. Her husband, Alastair Sterling, stood a few feet away, a king in his domain. He was the president and CEO of Sterling Enterprises, a global empire built by his grandfather, a man the media had dubbed the Ice King for his ruthless business acumen and perpetually cool demeanor. To the world, he was an untouchable monolith of wealth and influence. To Elara, he was the man who held her hand in the dark and whispered that her past was not a burden, but a testament to her strength. They had been married for 6 months, a whirlwind romance that had started in the most unlikely of places and had remained, at his insistence, a fiercely guarded secret. Tonight was supposed to be her unofficial introduction to his world, a world she was still terrified of. She saw him speaking with a senator, his expression unreadable, his posture exuding an authority that was as natural to him as breathing. He caught her eye across the room, and for a fleeting second, the ice in his gaze melted, replaced by a warmth reserved only for her. A small, almost imperceptible nod. "You're doing fine." She offered a weak smile in return, trying to believe him. The memory of the greasy spoon diner, the smell of stale coffee and bleach, the constant ache in her feet from double shifts, it all felt like a ghost clinging to her, whispering that she didn't belong. She had worked there for 8 years to pay off the mountain of medical debt her mother's illness had left behind, her own dreams buried under the weight of responsibility. That diner was where Alastair had found her, but no one here knew that. Here, she was a mystery, a blank slate they were all desperate to write upon. A cluster of young, arrogant men stood near the champagne fountain, their laughter sharp and cruel. One of them, Julian Vance, the heir to the Vance Industries fortune, let his eyes roam over Elara, a smirk playing on his lips. He leaned into his friend. "See that one? Sterling's new flavor of the month, I hear. Looks like she got lost on her way to the staff entrance." His friends snickered, their eyes dissecting her simple dress, her quiet posture. They saw a nobody. They saw a target. And in a world built on hierarchy and power, a target was an invitation for sport. Elara, feeling their stares like physical blows, turned away, her heart beginning to pound a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She just needed to make it through the night. The crowd ebbed and flowed like a glittering tide, eventually pulling Alastair into a closed-door meeting with some board members, leaving Elara adrift. He had squeezed her hand before he left, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I won't be long," he promised, his voice a low anchor in the swirling chaos. She found a quiet alcove near a service corridor, hoping to become invisible for a few moments, to catch her breath. Just as she was beginning to feel a sliver of calm, a young waitress, no older than 20, hurried past, her tray laden with glasses of champagne and Coca-Cola. Her heel caught on the plush carpet, and with a gasp, the tray tilted precariously. Elara's old instincts kicked in instantly. Without a thought, she lunged forward, her hand steadying the tray just as the first glass began to slide. "Whoa, careful," Elara said softly, helping the girl right the load. "I've done that 1,000 times. The trick is to keep your eye on the horizon, not the glasses." The waitress looked at her, startled, then offered a grateful, breathless smile. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much." As the girl hurried away, Elara felt a familiar, comfortable pang of her old life. It was a simple act of help, a moment of shared humanity. But her movement had drawn attention. Julian Vance and his coterie had drifted closer, their expressions predatory. Well, well, look what we have here," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. He stopped directly in front of Elara, blocking her escape. "Helping the staff? You must feel right at home." Elara's spine stiffened. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his without fear. "I believe in helping people when they're struggling. It's a concept you might find unfamiliar." A ripple of surprise went through his friends. They had expected her to cower. Julian's smirk tightened into a sneer. He was not used to being challenged, especially by someone he had already dismissed as insignificant. He picked up a full glass of Coca-Cola from a passing tray. "You know, you have a lot of nerve for a charity case," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Alistair Sterling might put a pretty dress on you, but you can't scrub the grime off. You're still just a waitress." He took a deliberate step closer. "Let me give you a little reminder of where you belong." And then, with a flick of his wrist, he inverted the glass. The dark, sticky liquid cascaded down the front of Elara's navy dress, a cold, shocking wave of humiliation. Ice cubes clattered to the floor around her feet. A collective gasp echoed through the immediate vicinity as conversations died. The music seemed to fade. All eyes were on her, on the dark, spreading stain that clung to her body, on the slow drip, drip, drip of soda onto the pristine marble floor. Elara didn't flinch. She didn't cry out or gasp in shock. She simply stood there, the cold seeping through the fabric, and held Julian Vance's gaze. Her silence was more profound than any scream. In her eyes, he didn't see shame or fear. He saw a quiet, unbreakable dignity that infuriated him more than any outburst could have. He had wanted to make her small, but in her stillness she had somehow grown larger. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Oops. Clumsy me." The laughter died in Julian's throat as if choked off by an invisible hand. A sudden, intense chill swept through the warm ballroom, a drop in temperature so profound it was almost physical. The crowd parted instinctively, a silent, fearful wave. Through the gap strode Alistair Sterling. He hadn't returned from his meeting, he had emerged. His face was a mask of glacial calm, but his eyes, fixed on the scene, burned with a cold, blue fire that promised devastation. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at the gawking crowd. His entire being was focused on Elara, on the dark stain marring her dress, on the single drop of soda clinging to her chin like a dark tear. He reached her in 3 long, silent strides. Without a word, he began to unbutton his tuxedo jacket, a custom-tailored piece worth more than the car she used to drive. He shrugged it off and gently, reverently, wrapped it around her shoulders, covering the stain. He pulled the lapels together, his fingers brushing her collarbone, a touch that was both a comfort and a vow. Only then did he turn his head, his gaze finally falling upon Julian Vance. The shift was terrifying. The warmth he had shown Elara vanished, replaced by an arctic void. "Vance," Alistair said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the room with the sharp finality of a guillotine. It was the voice he used to dismantle corporations, to end careers. Julian, who had been preening with arrogance moments before, visibly paled. The power dynamic had shifted with the force of a tectonic plate. "Alistair," Julian stammered, forcing a dismissive laugh. "Just a bit of a spill. An accident. You know how these parties are." Alistair took a half-step forward, and Julian flinched. "I know exactly how they are," Alistair replied, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a menacing purr. "I know that my guests are expected to conduct themselves with a baseline of human decency. A standard you have failed to meet with spectacular incompetence." He looked from Julian's stunned face to his snickering friends, who now looked as though they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. "Get out," Alistair said, the 2 words carrying the weight of a death sentence. "All of you." Julian's face flushed with a mixture of fury and humiliation. "Now see here, Sterling, you can't just—" "I can." Alistair interrupted, his calm unwavering. And I have. You have 10 seconds to vacate the premises before my security team demonstrates the concept of a hostile removal for you. He turned his back on Julian completely, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He placed a hand on the small of Ilara's back. Let's go home, he murmured, his voice once again gentle, meant only for her. As he guided her away, the crowd stared, a sea of shocked faces. Standing near the bar, Marcus Thorne, Alistair's chief legal counsel and oldest friend, watched them go. He took a long sip of his scotch, his expression grim. He had warned Alistair that bringing Ilara into this viper's nest unprepared was a risk. He had worried she was a vulnerability. But as he watched the rigid set of Alistair's shoulders and the quiet, unshaken dignity of the woman he was protecting, Marcus began to wonder if he hadn't misjudged her completely. He wasn't sure if she was Alistair's vulnerability, or his secret weapon. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent. The mirrored walls reflected the stark contrast between them, Alistair, radiating a controlled, simmering rage, and Ilara, wrapped in his oversized jacket, looking small but not broken. The heavy silence was a living thing, filled with unspoken fury and concern. When the doors opened directly into their sprawling apartment, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation, the tension finally broke. Alistair led her to the center of the vast living room, his hands gently turning her to face him. He looked at the jacket, at the dark stain peeking out from underneath. He will be ruined, Alistair stated, not as a threat, but as a simple, undeniable fact. I will dismantle his company, his reputation, his future. He will be a footnote in a cautionary tale by the time I am finished. Ilara looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. The woman who had been intimidated by chandeliers and champagne was gone. In her place was the woman who had survived loss and poverty, the woman who had stared down insolence without flinching. No, Alistair, she said, her voice soft but firm. You won't. He stared at her, baffled. Ilara, he humiliated you. He assaulted you in front of hundreds of people. There must be consequences, the consequences that he showed everyone exactly who he is, she replied, reaching up to touch his cheek. His skin was taut with anger. If you retaliate, if you use your power to crush him, you become a part of his ugly little story. You give him power. Don't do that. Don't let him drag you down to his level. Alistair's jaw remained tight. This was the part of him she was still learning, the part that saw the world as a chessboard where insults were met with overwhelming force. It was how he had protected his empire. It was how he thought he needed to protect her. He doesn't get to do that to you, he insisted, his voice raw. He doesn't get to touch you. It was then that the memory surfaced, the real reason for their connection, the moment he had first seen the steel beneath her waitress uniform. He had stumbled into her diner 6 months ago, just after midnight, his billion-dollar merger with a Japanese tech firm collapsing around him. He was exhausted, defeated, his team of translators and analysts having missed a crucial cultural nuance. He'd been speaking on the phone in frustrated, broken Japanese, his notes spread across the sticky table. Ilara had just refilled his coffee. As she walked away, she paused. Forgive me for eavesdropping, sir, she had said, her voice quiet. But the term you used, kiyaku, implies a cold, binding contract. For a deal built on trust, the word you might be looking for is yakusoku. It means a promise. It changes the entire tone of the negotiation from a demand to a partnership. Alistair had stared at her, dumbfounded. He had a team of Ivy League linguists on payroll, and this waitress, with tired eyes and worn-out shoes, had just identified the single word that was cratering his entire deal. He asked her how she knew. She explained that her father had been a diplomat, and she had grown up in embassies around the world, absorbing languages like a sponge before tragedy struck and her life took a different path. She spoke 5 languages fluently. In that moment, he hadn't seen a waitress. He had seen a brilliant mind, a hidden gem. He had come back every night for a week, not for the coffee, but for the conversation. He had found in her a clarity, an integrity that was absent in his world of corporate sharks. Now, standing in their penthouse, he saw that same clarity. She wasn't asking him to be weak, she was asking him to be wise. My honor doesn't need to be defended by destroying someone else, Alistair, she said, her thumb gently stroking his jawline. My honor is mine. It's what I kept when I had nothing else. He didn't take it from me tonight. He can't. His anger began to recede, replaced by a profound wave of awe. He had fallen in love with her mind, but it was her spirit, this unbreakable core of grace, that held him captive. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent. He was the Ice King, but she was the fire that kept him from freezing. The next morning, the city was gray and damp, the sky weeping a miserable drizzle that matched the mood in Alistair's office. The incident at the gala was no longer a private matter. It was a crisis. Marcus Thorne stood before Alistair's sprawling mahogany desk, his face etched with concern. He held a tablet displaying the preliminary agreement for the Sterling-Vance merger, a deal Alistair had been working on for over a year. It was his legacy project, a move that would solidify Sterling Enterprises as the undisputed leader in their sector for the next century. Alistair, we have a problem, Marcus began, his tone grave. Julian's father, Richard Vance, called me an hour ago. He was apologetic. But he was also clear. He expects you to let this go. He called it a youthful indiscretion. Alistair's eyes, which had been fixed on the rain-streaked window, snapped to Marcus. A youthful indiscretion? He's 30 years old, Marcus. And he assaulted my wife, I know. But Richard is also making it clear that if you retaliate, if you so much as issue a public statement, the merger is dead. Marcus said, laying the tablet on the desk. He framed it as a choice. You can have your pound of flesh, or you can have the deal of a lifetime. You can have both. This was the move Alistair had anticipated. It was a classic corporate power play, create a personal crisis to gain leverage in a professional negotiation. He had done it himself a dozen times. But this wasn't about leverage. This was about Alara. There is no choice, Alistair said coldly. The deal is irrelevant, Marcus sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He was Alistair's friend, but he was also his lawyer, the guardian of his corporate interests. Alistair, think about this. This merger is everything you've worked for. It's your masterpiece. Are you really going to throw it all away over one arrogant fool's drunken mistake? Alara herself told you not to retaliate. Alara told me not to stoop to his level. She didn't tell me to reward him. Alistair countered, his voice sharp. Signing this deal now, after what he did, would be an endorsement of his behavior. It would send a message to the entire world that a man like Julian Vance can treat a woman like Alara that way and not only get away with it, but profit from it. I will not sign. Marcus's face fell. He had feared this. He saw Alara as a complication, a wonderful person, perhaps, but a dangerous variable in Alistair's meticulously controlled world. So you're willing to sacrifice the future of this company for her? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Alistair stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city he commanded. Marcus, you still don't understand, he said quietly, his back to his friend. Alara isn't a threat to this company. She isn't a liability I have to protect. Her insight, her perspective, it's the most valuable asset I've ever acquired. The deal isn't the masterpiece. She is. He turned around, his expression resolute. If I have to choose between a business deal and the integrity of the woman I love, then the choice was made the moment I met her. Tell Richard Vance the merger is off. And tell him his son has made a very powerful enemy. Marcus stared at his friend, a man he thought he knew completely. The Ice King was melting, and Marcus wasn't sure if the flood would nourish the kingdom or drown it. He picked up the tablet, the multi-billion-dollar deal now feeling as worthless as a coaster. As you wish, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. He knew this was only the beginning. The Vances would not take this lying down. A war was coming. Julian Vance was not used to consequences. His life had been a long, unbroken series of privileges, his mistakes cushioned by his father's wealth, and influence. When his father told him that Alastair Sterling had not only rejected their unofficial apology, but had also pulled out of the merger, Julian felt a surge of indignant rage. Sterling was choosing that nobody, that Waitress, over a legacy-defining deal. It was an insult of the highest order. Humiliated and furious, Julian decided he wasn't going to be the villain in this story. He was going to be the victim. He made a call to a contact he kept on retainer at a notorious tabloid news site, a man who specialized in character assassination. Julian spun a masterful tale. He painted himself as the hapless gentleman, trying to be polite to Sterling's mysterious, socially awkward new companion. He claimed Alara had been rude and dismissive, acting entitled, and that in a clumsy moment she had bumped into him, causing the drink to spill. The crowning touch was his feigned concern for Alastair, suggesting his old rival had been ensnared by a cunning gold digger who was now trying to sabotage his business relationships for her own gain. The story, complete with a blurry, unauthorized photo of Alara from the gala, ran the next morning under the headline, "Sterling's Cinderella or a corporate saboteur? Billionaire's waitress girlfriend causes chaos at charity gala." The article was brutal. It dredged up Alara's past, framing her years of hard work to pay off medical debt as a sordid history of low-wage jobs. It hinted at a calculated scheme to trap the lonely billionaire. The narrative was clear and vicious. She was trash who had gotten lucky, and now her poor breeding was showing. The story spread like wildfire. It was picked up by mainstream financial news outlets, framed as a question of Alastair Sterling's judgment. Was the Ice King's focus slipping? Was his new relationship making him erratic? The Sterling Enterprises board, already nervous about the collapsed merger, grew frantic. Whispers started in the hallways and on conference calls. Who was this woman? Why was she suddenly more important than the company's future? Alastair was in a meeting when his secretary interrupted, her face pale, holding a tablet with the article displayed. He read it, his expression hardening with each venomous word until his face was a mask of stone. He dismissed the meeting, his fury a palpable force in the room. He went straight to the penthouse, finding Alara in the library, a book open in her lap. She had already seen it. Her face was composed, but he could see the hurt in her eyes, a deep wound that no jacket could cover. She looked up at him, a sad smile touching her lips. "It seems I'm famous now," she said, her voice quiet. He crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were cold. "I will sue them into oblivion," he growled. "I will buy the parent company and fire every single person who touched this story." "No, Alastair," she said, her grip tightening on his. "That's what they want. They want you to be the raging billionaire, the bully. It proves their point. It makes me look like the person who incited the beast." He looked at her, his heart aching. He had wanted to protect her from his world, but he had only succeeded in making her its primary target. "What do we do?" he asked, the question an admission that his usual tactics, overwhelming force and financial warfare, were useless here. This was a battle of perception, a war of narrative, and they were losing. Alara looked past him, her gaze distant, her mind already working. The fear and hurt were there, but beneath them, something else was stirring, resolve. The same resolve that had gotten her through years of grueling work and personal loss. They had attacked her past. They had attacked her character. They had underestimated her. And that was a mistake she knew how to exploit. Alara let go of Alastair's hands and stood up, walking over to the large window that overlooked the heart of the financial district. For a long moment, she watched the relentless flow of traffic, the endless river of people, each with their own story, their own struggles. They saw her as a caricature, a headline. They had no idea who she really was. She had spent the last 6 months listening. While the world saw her as a silent, ornamental presence at Alastair's side, she had been absorbing everything. At dinners, on calls, in the car, Alastair would talk, thinking aloud about his work. He spoke of the Sterling-Vance merger not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of people, of integrating corporate cultures. He had been particularly focused on the third major partner in the proposed conglomerate, a Japanese firm, Kaido Precision, and a German engineering giant, Rheincorp. He'd lamented the difficulties in finding a common language, both literally and figuratively. "They think they can win this fight in the media," Elara said, turning back to face Alistair. Her eyes were no longer clouded with hurt. They were sharp, analytical. "They want you to fight them with lawyers and money. But that's their battlefield. We need to move the battle to ours." Alistair rose, intrigued. "What is our battlefield?" "Integrity," she said simply. "And intelligence. The merger with Vance Industries was always flawed, Alistair. You said it yourself. Their corporate culture is aggressive and arrogant. It would have clashed disastrously with Kaido's philosophy of harmony and Rheincorp's emphasis on meticulous, collaborative process." He nodded slowly. "I know. But the market share we would have gained was too significant to ignore. I thought we could manage the cultural differences after the acquisition, but you can't manage a relationship that begins with an insult," Elara countered. Her mind was racing, connecting threads no one else had seen. She remembered Alistair complaining that the Vance team's proposals to the foreign partners were repeatedly met with polite but firm resistance. Vance's team had dismissed it as posturing. Elara suspected it was something deeper. "That night at the diner," she said, her voice gaining momentum, "I didn't just correct a word. I identified a fundamental misunderstanding of an entire culture. Julian Vance proved at the gala that he has no respect for people he deems beneath him. Do you think his company's negotiation strategy is any different? They see Kaido and Rheincorp not as partners, but as conquests." This was it. This was her hidden gift in action. It wasn't just about speaking multiple languages. It was about understanding the cultures behind them. It was about seeing the human element in the cold, hard world of business. "What are you proposing?" Alistair asked, a glimmer of hope, of excitement, entering his eyes. He was beginning to see her plan. "Don't fight the tabloid story," she said. "Let them think they've won. Instead, you call an emergency joint board meeting. Sterling, Vance, and the primary stakeholders from Kaido and Rheincorp on video conference. Everyone will expect you to capitulate, to announce you're saving the deal, to apologize for the drama I've caused. Julian will be sitting there, smug and victorious." A slow smile spread across Alistair's face. It was the smile he got when he was about to checkmate an opponent. "And then what?" "And then," Elara said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence, "you introduce me. Not as your girlfriend, not as a victim. You introduce me as your senior strategic advisor for international relations. And you give me the floor." He looked at her, truly looked at her. The woman in the simple dress, the former waitress, the subject of public scorn. And he saw a queen. "They wanted to put you in your place," Alistair said, his voice filled with admiration. "They have no idea what your place truly is." The atmosphere in the Sterling Enterprises boardroom was thick with tension. It was a chamber built for power, with a long, polished obsidian table that reflected the grim faces of the board members like a dark mirror. At one end of the table sat Richard Vance and his son, Julian. Julian wore an expression of supreme, barely concealed triumph. He believed he had won. He had outmaneuvered the great Alistair Sterling, forcing him to this public act of surrender. On the large screens that dominated one wall, the stoic faces of Mr. Tanaka from Kaido Precision and Herr Schmidt from Rheincorp stared back, their expressions unreadable. Alistair sat at the head of the table, a picture of calm. Beside him, in a chair that was usually reserved for his chief counsel, sat Elara. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back in a severe, professional style. She looked nothing like the woman from the tabloid photo. She looked formidable. Marcus Thorne stood by the wall, his arms crossed, his face a mask of nervous anticipation. He had spent the last 24 hours preparing the legal groundwork for what was about to happen, his initial skepticism replaced by a grudging, growing admiration for Elara's audacity. Alistair cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for attending on such short notice," he began, his voice even and controlled. There has been a great deal of speculation regarding the recent turbulence surrounding the proposed merger and my personal life. The board and our prospective partners deserve clarity. Julian leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. This was it. The apology. The groveling. I want to be clear, Alistair continued, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on Julian. The Sterling-Vance merger, as it was proposed, is not just in jeopardy. It is terminated. A collective gasp went through the Sterling board members. Richard Vance shot forward in his seat, his face turning a shade of purple. What is the meaning of this, Sterling? We had an agreement. We had a negotiation, Alistair corrected calmly. One which recent events have proven would be untenable. It has become apparent that the leadership at Vance Industries lacks the fundamental cultural literacy and basic decency required for a global partnership of this magnitude. Julian shot to his feet. This is because of her, he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Alara. You're throwing away $100 billion deal because your little waitress got her dress dirty. The room erupted into chaos. The board members were shouting, Richard Vance was yelling threats, but Alistair simply raised a hand, and silence fell once more. On the contrary, Alistair said, his voice cutting through the noise. This is because of her. He turned to Alara, his expression softening with pride. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to my most trusted advisor and the head of Sterling's new International Strategy Division, Alara Sterling. He had used her new, legal name. The finality of it hung in the air. She has identified critical, fatal flaws in our previous approach. Alara, if you would. All eyes swiveled to Alara. She rose slowly, her poise absolute. She looked at the shocked faces around the table, at the sputtering rage of Julian Vance, and felt a calm certainty settle over her. The room was no longer intimidating. It was just a room. They were just people. And she had something to say. Alara walked to the head of the table, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room and on the screens. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't acknowledge the Vances at all. Her focus was on the board and, more importantly, on the faces of Mr. Tanaka and Herr Schmidt. She began to speak, her English clear and concise. For months, our teams have struggled to align our visions for this merger. Vance Industries has characterized the resistance from our international partners as simple negotiating tactics. This is a fundamental misreading of the situation. She paused, then turned her body slightly to face the screen displaying Mr. Tanaka. She bowed her head respectfully and continued, but this time, she spoke in flawless, formal Japanese. Tanaka-san, the Vance proposal repeatedly used language of acquisition and control. It spoke of absorbing Kaito's assets and streamlining your processes. This language ignores the principle of harmony, which is the bedrock of your corporate and national culture. It was not a proposal for a partnership. It was a declaration of conquest. It was an insult. Mr. Tanaka's eyebrows shot up. A flicker of profound surprise and understanding crossed his stoic face. He responded in Japanese, his voice filled with a new level of respect, confirming her analysis. Julian Vance stared, his mouth agape. He couldn't understand a word, but he understood the shift in the room's power dynamic perfectly. Before he could process it, Alara turned to the other screen. She addressed Herr Schmidt in perfect, articulate German. Herr Schmidt, the Vance proposal dismissed Rheincorp's concerns about procedural integrity and quality control as bureaucratic red tape. It failed to appreciate that for you, the process, the Ordnung, is not an obstacle to the result, it is the guarantee of the result. To suggest abandoning it is to suggest abandoning the very core of your company's century-long success. Herr Schmidt, a man known for his stern, unyielding demeanor, broke into a slow, broad smile. He replied in German, commending her astonishing insight and stating that she had articulated their primary concerns more clearly than their own team had managed to in 6 months of negotiation. The Sterling board members were staring at Alara as if she had just performed a miracle. Marcus Thorne allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Alistair watched his wife, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. Finally, Ilara turned her attention back to the room, switching back to English. Her gaze swept over the stunned faces of the Vance contingent. "The issue was never a spilled drink," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "The issue is a philosophy of disrespect. A company that treats a person with contempt because they believe them to be a waitress will treat a business partner with the same contempt if they believe they have the upper hand. The arrogance that led Julian Vance to humiliate me is the same arrogance that has made his company blind to the nuances of global partnership. It is not just a moral failing, it is a fatal business flaw. Sterling Enterprises cannot and will not build its future on such a rotten foundation." She finished speaking. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Richard Vance slumping back in his chair, his face the color of ash. Julian stood frozen, utterly exposed. He had been defeated not by money or power, but by intelligence and grace. He had tried to put a waitress in her place, and she had just cost him his empire. The fallout was immediate and decisive. On the video screens, Mr. Tanaka and Herr Schmidt, speaking in English for the benefit of all, formally withdrew from any negotiations involving Vance Industries. Then, Mr. Tanaka addressed Alistair directly. "Sterling-san, your wife's insight has been illuminating. Kaido Precision would be honored to open a direct dialogue with Sterling Enterprises to discuss a new partnership. One built on mutual respect and understanding," Herr Schmidt quickly concurred. In the space of 10 minutes, Ilara had not only dismantled the Vance merger but had also single-handedly forged the foundation for two new, more powerful, and more harmonious alliances. The Sterling board, which had been on the verge of revolt, was now looking at Alistair and Ilara with a mixture of awe and fervent relief. They had not lost a deal, they had dodged a bullet and secured a brighter future. Richard Vance, a man broken, said nothing. He simply rose, grabbed his son's arm, and walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance. Julian's career, his reputation, and his future were in ruins. The tabloid story was now a joke, a testament to his own catastrophic misjudgment. Later that day, Marcus found Ilara in Alistair's office, looking out at the city. He approached her quietly. "Mrs. Sterling," he began, his voice humbled. "I owe you an apology. I saw you as a risk to Alistair, to the company. I was wrong. You are his greatest asset. You are our greatest asset." Ilara turned and gave him a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you, Marcus. But I'm not an asset. I'm his wife." That evening, the city lights seemed to burn brighter than ever from the penthouse window. Alistair came up behind Ilara, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the endless energy of the world below. "I saw the Ice King melt today," she whispered, leaning back against his chest. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "The Ice King was a lonely man building a fortress. I don't need a fortress anymore." He turned her in his arms, his eyes searching hers, filled with a love and admiration that was boundless. "They threw everything they had at you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They tried to shame you, to belittle you, to reduce you to a caricature. And you met their ugliness with brilliance. You met their cruelty with grace." He gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I thought my job was to protect you from my world. But your job was to save me from it. You were never my weakness, Ilara. You were always my strength." She rose on her toes and kissed him, a kiss that was not about passion, but about homecoming. It was a promise, a yakusoku, that they would face whatever came next together. "So we asked you again, what is the true measure of a person's worth? It is not the station they hold or the money they possess. It is the dignity they maintain when they have nothing, and the grace they show when they have everything. It is the hidden strength that lies within, waiting for its moment to shine." Ilara's story is a reminder that you should never judge a book by its cover, and never, ever underestimate the quiet person in the room. What did you think of Ilara's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share this story if it inspired you.